Let's take her home. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here at our closing remarks and our keynote tonight. My name is Zach Rondinelli, and I have the absolute pleasure of moderating this keynote. For those of you who don't know me, I am a member of the organizing committee for our symposium, as well as a PhD student at Brock University's Faculty of Education and a K-12 intermediate senior English educator in the Niagara region. Just a couple of quick reminders before we get started. You're all old hats at this by now, but just some reminders. The Zoom chat window is open, as it has been throughout the symposium, for you to post comments and questions. When we open up for questions, you're more than welcome to use the raise hand function if you would like instead, and you can ask the question yourself. Another reminder that the session is recorded and will be posted on YouTube following the symposium, and that any links that we share within the chat will be saved, and we will be sending out a resource document to all of you afterwards. Joining us for the final keynote is Dr. Eleanor T. From Wilfrid Laurier University, who had the unenviable task of bringing together all of the various threads and ideas that have popped up for us throughout this two-day symposium, and there are so many. So first, I'll introduce Dr. T, and then I'll invite her to share her thoughts with us for about 15 minutes or so, at which point we'll open up the floor to questions from all of you. So Dr. T is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a professor of English at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario. She has published on cultural memory, graphic novel, Asian North American, and 18th century literature. She was a Fulbright Canada Visiting Research Chair at UC Santa Barbara in 2019. And her recent works include Asian Fail, Narratives of Disenchantment and the Model Minority from the University of Illinois Press in 2017. And with Candida Rifkind and Nima Nagibi, she co-edited an issue of AB, Autobiography Studies on Migration, Exile, and Diaspora in Graphic Life Narratives in the spring of 2020. She also has edited a forthcoming collection of scholarly essays called Beyond the Icon, Asian American Graphic Narratives, coming in 2022. Eleanor, thank you so much for being with us and sharing with us your thoughts about the work to come.
Thank you. Well, this is a daunting task because it was such a great conference. I want to say that this symposium makes a historic moment, marks a historic moment in the study of comics and graphic novel, because not only have the organizers, Dominic Grace, Candida Rifkind, Zachary Rondinelli, Megan Scanlon, and Ivan Kokmarek, established this important society for the promotion of Canadian comics, but by choosing to commemorate 80 years, they've also made scholars and the media and the public more aware of the little known origins of the history of Canadian comics from the 1940s. And in addition, a number of participants have remarked on the importance of the symposium to make links between scholars, creators, librarians, and independent presses. The way in which we've all been made to feel that the study and the reading of comics is validated and affirmed. So I'm going to try to link together some of those sessions, and I think I'm going to mention everyone, but excuse me if I've left off one or two. So the papers presented in day one highlighted the ways in which the development of comics and graphic novels is connected to other facets of society, both in Canada and elsewhere. Presentations by Andrew O'Malley, Amy Wright, Brian Montgomery demonstrated how politics and history, moral anxieties about comics' bad influence, and the gay liberation movement all impacted its evolution. I also appreciated scholars who had insights about local producers, Darren Weschler on the Annex and Coach House Press, for example. So in discussions on the first day, panelists talked about gatekeepers and censorship for librarians, vendors, and creators, which remained a threat, a soft threat, until 2018, Amy Wright noted. It was fascinating to hear accounts from working artists, those who worked even right through the pandemic. Fiona Smythe, Zivan, Sandra DeMay on zines, comic, and self-publishing. Cole Pauls and Ho-Chi Anderson about how they began as artists, the importance of visual storytelling, how they use traditional and technological instruments, and the challenges of drawing real and historic people. They were very inspiring and certainly very enlightening and entertaining in their presentations. We are also very blessed to have the work of librarians and teachers who are creating useful resources, archives, databases. James Wiley, Ro Diamant, Leah Brochure, and Rachel Osselin. Other presentations talked about the challenges in teaching, such as Julie Rack, making diverse groups and online communities visible. That's Christian Rains, Matthew Barrett, Lucas Chomley. Having the courage to talk about mental illness and health, Irene Valencia's, Amy Matsowita, and Eva Karpinski's presentations. A number of presenters questioned the very premise of what we're doing as researchers, creators, and producers of Canadian comics, such as Lorraine York, and also Jamie Michaels, who reminded us of Canada's attempt to put forth a face of multiculturalism, and also at the same time ignoring the context of our history of colonialism, and how new comic historians are writing back and questioning this very history. So these presentations lead us to think about the beyond or future of Canadian comics as a space where we can continue to envision our different identities in exciting forms through graphic memoirs, historical narratives, through zines, webcomics, fantasy, as children and YA books, and on social media platforms. How can the term Canadian be welcoming and more inclusive of those who have traditionally been excluded, such as immigrants from non-English or French-speaking communities, diasporic people, Black and Indigenous people, Canadians who no longer live in Canada, or those who cross borders, refugees, LGBTQ community, the disabled, and even the aged, at the same time as it continues to signify those things we have come to think of as quintessentially Canadian. One note of caution, I felt that there was a lot of talk about, because we're thinking about the dark history of Canada, but we shouldn't lump all Canadians as Canadian comics as homogeneous. When I think about Canadian graphic novels, they are very interesting and diverse already in matter and style. Where else would one find stories of working as a stripper, a man obsessed with collecting, two brothers playing hockey in love with the same girl, documenting experiences with prostitutes, traveling to North Korea, interspecies galactic couple, being biracial and queer in high school, caring for a mother with Alzheimer's, or shoplifting in a big city, or the trauma of Indigenous young men. It is encouraging to see that Canadian comics are taking up more space and able to take on bigger questions, also being taught more and more in secondary and post-secondary schools. Particularly for this symposium, it was great that librarians and archivists spoke about their works, starting with John Bell, but also about the challenges of collecting from Megan Scanlon, Lucia Cervantes, Joe Ullman, Mark Scheinbaum, Deborah Mearts-Willison, and Vic Stapleton in the GLAM session. I was also very impressed with the people working with the presses, such as those represented by today's roundtable. Julia Paul Miranda, about the gratification of being able to support artists for a number of years. Nigan Sinclair, who talked about the non-fictional retellings of 150 years. Luc Bosset and Frédéric Gauthier, who talked about the difficulty of accessing English Canadian market. Sarah Soller about the goals of Emma Nata. And and how these origins of, and I think we should remember that these origins of Canadian comics have shown us that as Canadians, we are resourceful and enterprising. We turn a scarcity into an opportunity. As we did in the 1940s, we can today. So thinking about the future, and this is my final paragraph, a number of participants have noted that the creation, reading, and distribution of comics will be more and more influenced by global readership, digital platforms, social media, but also shaped by the kind of accompanying YouTube videos and trailers, podcasts. As discussed yesterday, we have inherited a problematic history as Canadians, but it is also this place which has given us space, opportunity, and we have to admit, grant money to critique it. More useful than an outright refusal of Canadian identity with its accompanying privileges is a position we might call critical Canadian, like critical race theory. For many of us, Canadian is only one of the many identities that we occupy, as suggested by several participants. And each of us belong to more than one group or category. So our comic creators are Canadian, but they're also part of other alternative communities. For example, Black Lives Movement, Indigenous community, Asian North American, skater punk community. There is much to do in the way of revising Canadian comics history, revising Canadian history, working towards the legitimization of graphic novels in mainstream space, in having a bigger place in secondary, post-secondary schools, national awards, library collections, supporting those who have not had a voice, locating and archiving useful resources for future scholars and researchers, and creating more connections between English and Francophone readers and creators, and finding, I think, intersectional connections between racialized, sexualized minorities. So it's been a great conference, and congratulations to all the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. I think that was an absolutely fantastic way to pull everything together. But I'd like to open up now to know if there's anybody out there who have questions for Eleanor about the conference at large, anything that Eleanor just spoke about. Please post those in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask directly right now.
I think it should be a discussion more than a question to me.
Yeah,
I was just summing up.
Comments, anything would be fantastic. I guess I have a question, Eleanor, just about something you said, maybe half comment, half question, but I think the point you made about the narratives of Canadian comics or that are less dark, and those sorts of stories out there, and not leaving them out of the record. I think that was an important point to make. And I guess my question is, why do you think that impulse exists? Why is it that we tend to focus on, and even within this conference, we talked a lot about those particular stories, those particular narratives, and maybe a little less so on the brighter, I don't know that I want to say positive. I don't want to suggest that it's a positive or negative relationship, but do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm not sure I think for teaching purposes, I think in the last panel, I was commenting on this, that I like the serious, heavy stories more. There's more to say. But certainly I think maybe it's also a preference, because I don't know, what did the rest of you think? I was actually surprised. Maybe it's the nature of the call for papers that call for 80 years history, right? but that there weren't more papers on the sort of well-known Canadian graphic novelists.
Yeah, and I think too, I'm thinking about framing too, and your comment about the CFP, and the way that we're framing it around the 80th anniversary celebration, I think that makes sense to me. And we've questioned a lot, the framing of nationhood, and that 80 years has been pretty tied to, the Canadian nation. And so that makes sense to me. I'd love to hear what other people have to say about that.
Or is it because there's already enough work on those?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about anybody else here. I know my first experience with, what I would call the first Canadian graphic novel I remember reading was Jeff Lemire's Essex County.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's one of those texts that really, sort of blew my mind. And I remember it being one of the first comics that I read that made me want to read more about the comics medium, not just, read superhero comics, but go beyond that and do more thinking about it. And I've never really reflected on the fact that that was a Canadian, or a Canadian creator and a Canadian text that really sparked that interest for me. And there are so many, more well-established, I suppose you could say, Canadian creators doing work even into the US right now that we did not focus on here. So I think that was a really interesting point. Canada, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, this is sort of something that was percolating in the last panel and the one before that, with the discussions of Canadian comics today, but also thinking back to Fiona Smith yesterday, talking about psychedelia and that movement. And I don't know if this is just a massive overgeneralization. And Eleanor, it goes to kind of, how I think we're both drawn to those serious stories. But I'm kind of wondering why we aren't, well, what has happened, not just to psychedelia, but to less narrative forms of Canadian comics, and not necessarily more playful, but a kind of embracing of the silly and the experimental and the abstract. So it does seem to me that, and I include myself in this and not necessarily, thrilled about it, but I am also drawn to the very narrative kinds of Canadian comics, both autobiographies and history stories. So I'm wondering if we're missing out on a whole other scene because of that attention to storytelling. But also I'm wondering if the psychedelia moment was a specific historical moment. Although then hearing Vianne talk, I think she's closest to what Fiona and her crew are up to, with play and a kind of anarchic sense and gifting their comics away, and really like a sense of almost the silliness of Canadian comics as well. But I think we're really narrative driven at this moment. And I'm wondering what we're missing by being so focused on story.
I think people should just chime in. Wayne Morgan, go ahead. I think you had your hand up.
Well, Candida, I actually can say something about that, because that is the ethnographic series that I kind of highlighted in my talk. I divided those books that they publish into narrative and non-narrative, and there are two striking examples of work which is not necessarily Canadian work. One is by Lachlan Jane, and it is Things That Art. However, they published by the University of Toronto Press, right, in the ethnographic series. So that's called Things That Art. And it is an amazing book, very philosophical. Both actually are, okay, I don't know if I put it here, YouTube, she's talking about it in this YouTube video. The other one is by Alice Waterstone, and that is Light in Dark Times. And that's another philosophical book, which is non-narrative. It's actually all extremely static, in the sense of like spirals, whirls, that draw you into this kind of, discussion of how we as humanity, so taking up very big topics, how we as humanity can arrive in a place where we can agree that we need to save the planet and ourselves. So Light in Dark Times. But Jane's book is really interesting, because this is like queering epistemology really through, and I don't know, I'm just recommending this, but this is like a cabinet of curiosities. She draws on particular themes, and they totally play like image against language and defy what we know about categories. So, you know, it's totally anti-categorical, anti-normative thinking that she's managing to, you know, present through cartoons, mini drawings, mini cartoons. So you can check out those two books, I think, from Jane and from Alice Waterson. So they happen to be both included under anthropology, though. So definitely non-narrative comics, which have their own agenda, their own kind of like, you know, epistemological take on what we need to think about in this particular moment, in the present moment.
I guess, Eva, I totally get that. That's a sort of intellectual take. I'm thinking more of like Leanne Shapton's books, which are illustrations of trees, or Aminder Dhaliwal and her funny books. So I guess I'm just like I think part of the problem is what Julie Rack was getting at in her question in the last panel. Like, what do we do when we institutionalize comics? And I think when we do that, we're creating canons, right? So I think what maybe Eleanor and Zach are asking us to think about is how we might be reproducing that. And like, I don't know how I would teach a Leanne Shapton book. I think it's Leaves, right? Trees of Canada is one of her books. So like what do we do with that? That's still part of the production and part of Canadian comics, but doesn't fit maybe our desire to tell stories.
I see Irene has posted a number of graphic novels that deal with difficult topics but are funny.
Julie, you just popped on? Did you have a comment or question you want to talk about?
I'm wondering if it isn't the idea of the graphic book that is partly driving the way that those things are being received, because that's really from the autobiographical comic tradition, right? That starts with things like Mouse really becoming important. And, you know, there's not that many people teaching the Watchmen, you know, still, although I bet there will be more than there are now. But like when we're kind of thinking about that, I think that we're also missing Canadian comics history ephemera. Like it's just, you know, and the collectors who are here and the people who've done a lot of that really behind the scenes work to try to make that material shine. And there's a lot of people like that who are here. I really appreciate hearing from them, because we're going to lose that stuff. Like, you know, Jasper the Bear is not about trauma. But it's really hard to teach because there's almost nothing to find there. You know what I mean? And so I think that's also, it's about our medium. It's about what circulates and what's easy to see, and you know, and where we can find things on Instagram even, or other places. And so to me, that's part of the challenge, is what are we going to do about the medium of it? So that'd be my question for everybody, really. What do we do about that?
Dominic.
Yeah, that's a tough question. It came up yesterday. I find I confront this. I assign graphic novels for the courses, but then I want to show them the serialized versions. But then my collector side kicks in, and it's like, do I want like 16 students handling these books? And it's a real dilemma. But this is something I think that John Bell especially was talking about, which is just finding that stuff is hard. But even if you can find it, it's so prohibitive to purchase it that it's very, very difficult to find ways for students to actually access it in the way that it was meant to be accessed. Digital archives are great, and the fact that all the Bell stuff is digitally archived is fabulous, but it's fundamentally different to actually hold the comic in your hand than it is to read the digital version. So this is, I think it's a real challenge for especially people who are interested in the materiality of text. It's a very difficult question about pedagogy.
And today I almost feel like materiality is one of those things that we have to be considering more consciously, right? And I think about when the glam panels and talking about how we're archiving and saving these comics. And I believe it was Eddie Smet yesterday who was talking about donating his comics and his collections. Like, these are the things that I think, as a relatively young comic scholar, that I would love to spend time in a library with, you know, reading through and exploring. And these are texts and material objects that I never had the opportunity to have my hands on physically. And the fact that they're going to be maintained and archived and saved, I think, is such an important piece of the larger puzzle here, speaking to both Julie and Dominic's point there. Yeah, exactly, Dominic. Silver Surfer comes to mind.
So I think this conference has left us with a lot of things that we can do going forward.
I think Lorraine makes a really good point in the chat about we also tend to focus on people who have a lifetime of output and who stay in comics. But then you get someone like Julie Doucette, who Fiona said in her slideshow left because of misogyny and is only now coming back. And then, you know, Ho.J. Anderson comes and goes from film and comics, but he stayed in comics. So there's also the problem of the career path. And I'm just going to generalize and suggest that affects non-males more than males in terms of artists and people coming in and out of the field and production. So it's also our idea of who is an artist and what counts as a comics career, I think.
Wayne, I saw that you were raising your hand there with a comment. We'd love to hear what you'd like to say.
I'm in my late 70s. I got a lot of comic books in the basement. I got even more books about comics. Tons of them. And my first subscription when I was about, I don't know, 8 or 10 was to Donald Duck. And it came to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and it said, Master Wayne Morton. I loved it. Of course, my mother threw out all my comic books. But in the 60s, I began to buy a few of these Marvel comics because it had become a thing. I didn't like much of them. Still don't like superheroes. But I collected the artists rather than the content. And I was really good on the illustration style artists, Men at War and Space Adventures and Isn't That. But I've been an art curator all my life, and I've been able to wander into popular culture institutionally and as an independent scholar, and done a lot of papers and stuff. And I've become sort of an expert on Palmer, Cox, and the Brownies, who's the grandfather of the comics. I'm thrilled that Ivan and you guys have put together this conference. And it's been wonderful to hear what's going on. Somewhere here in my notes, I've got something I wanted to say, and that is that I don't buy comics anymore. I'm more interested in who and what they are and the history. And I have, since I was about 12, collected panel cartoons from the newspapers, and I put them into books. Mr. Tweedy and Dennis the Menace and Walt Kelly and all those guys. And I'm part of my commitment to my life and my career in the art world is because my mother gave my father a copy of Herbie in 1947. Herbie was a cartoon in maple leaf in the Canadian Army. And I read that thing about 1 million times as a kid. And it got me into art school and colored my life forever. Then in the conversation with Ivan over his publication, I admitted this and then learned from Ivan that a number of the World War II artists joined up, and they might be found in Maple Leaf and in the other armed forces publications made for the forces. And in the last year, I've gone down this rabbit hole finding World War II and World War I and an enormous number of cartoons produced by armed forces members for their interior magazines and newspapers. And simultaneously, I've been in correspondence with people who are researching left-wing labor and communist papers, newspapers, and the cartoonists who were in those magazines. And lastly, not 10 days ago, I came across a list of federal prison newspapers in the United States, and all of the newspapers from 1900 to 2020, in which there has to be cartoons, and there has to be an equal amount in Canada. Thus, I know the conference was about comic books, but comic books is where I started, and here I am now, deep into this other world of making pictures and making jokes. That is absolutely a thrilling research endeavor that I'm sure some of you might share. So this is where I find myself, having started off with Donald Duck, and there's so much so much stuff not yet researched and not yet. It's just thrilling. And I thank you for all of your efforts with this conference.
That's a wonderful story.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing your experiences, Wayne. That was fantastic. And I think you've touched on, where we can go from here and some other things that we can be doing. But I know that we are nearing, or we're slightly over our scheduled end time. So I just want to ask, Eleanor, is there any final thoughts that you'd like to send us off with?
No, I think Candida should have the last word.
No one ever gives me the last word, Eleanor, so thank you. One thing I want to say is I really want to thank our guest moderators, who we leaned on quite heavily to join us, because we weren't enough people on the committee to moderate every session. And so I hope I don't forget any of them, but Andy Brown from Conundrum, Peter Berkamo from The Beguiling, and Anna Papard, I think, were our three guest moderators, and Benjamin Wu. And we're just so grateful that they stepped in to kind of lead those discussions. I really want to shout out to them. And I would suggest any of them as moderators for hire if you're organizing anything yourselves. I think Zach probably has some wrap-up comments to make. So I'll just thank everyone and say we're going to keep the conversation going. We have some ideas from people to keep people in touch, and definitely check your junk mail for those emails from us that inevitably go in there, because there will be more to come.
Yes.
But also, I think we should, before you finish, I think the rest of us should give a round of applause for the organizers. It's been such a great conference, really. And it's a lot of work behind the scenes. I'm sure all people who attended would agree that it's been a really, really great conference. And we've learned so much. And it's also been really good to keep, to make us in contact with each other. Okay, go ahead, Zachary.
Absolutely. So thank you again, Eleanor, for being here with us and for wrapping all of this up. I really, really appreciate it. And I do just have a couple last minute things to say before we head off. So first, I just want to remind everybody that all of our live synchronous recordings will be uploaded to YouTube shortly. So I would encourage you to go back and to review those at your leisure. For everybody who is here and registered, just please do remember that the pre-recorded presentations will only be available for 30 days, at which point they're going to be coming down from YouTube. So if you do want to go back and rewatch any of those pre-recorded presentations, or you were unable to watch those, please do that as soon as possible. One more time, I'd like to remind you all about the special issue of Canadian Literature that Candida and I are co-editing. Just as a reminder, we're inviting submissions of original unpublished work in either prose or comics form, and the deadline for submission to that is January 5th, 2022, and Canada has just shared the link there in the chat. As she mentioned, there will be a post-symposium survey coming to you in the next couple of weeks, and we would really appreciate your support and feedback for this event. Please fill it out. It is our hope that this symposium might not be a one and done sort of event. So any feedback will help us towards that goal. Lastly, I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you who came and attended today. As I mentioned previously, we had 194 registers for this event. Some of those were duplicates, so we were around 180, which we, blew our expectations out of the water, and we are so thankful for that. When we came together for this, we knew we didn't want it to just be a straight academic conference, and I hope that this symposium has demonstrated how there is a different way to do things, and the inclusion that we aimed for, I believe we reached. In just some statistics that Canada shared with me earlier, of the over 190 registered participants, only 34 self-identified as post-secondary instructors or students, 21% identified as comics creators, 14% as librarians, archivists, or curators, and 15% as fans and collectors. And there were others. There were so many other categories in there where people self-identified as well. But I just think that that's a pretty amazing breakdown. And then even better, 51.5% of attendees registered as a gender identity other than male, which I think is absolutely incredible. So the bottom line is that we have been so fortunate to have these really amazing presenters and keynotes, but also all of the attendees who made this event what it is. And, we would not have had such a fantastic experience here, I truly believe, without all of us being here. And this event was something very special to us, and hopefully it was to you as well. So thank you all very much for being here.